Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our final webinar of the HEED series on future-proofing humanitarianism, actioning policy, and strengthening governance. It's part of our webinar series on people, policy, and innovation in humanitarian energy. We're taking it from theory to practice over the past couple of weeks, and it's by, as I said, the HEED project team and Coventry University. Our policy webinar today is in partnership with the Global Platform for Action for Sustainable Energy in Displacement Settings, and I am your host today, Hajar Al-Qaddu, and I'm currently a research associate here at Coventry University working on the Humanitarian Engineering and Energy for Displacement project in partnership with Practical Action and Scene Connect. So this webinar, as I said, is the final of our series. It's here to really refocus on the policy landscape for energy access in displacement settings. We're constantly bombarded with statements such as, ensuring the world's poor have access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services enables poverty eradication. And these kind of statements are, I guess, plastered all over policies globally and throughout the humanitarian sector itself. But where does this leave us in the humanitarian sector? And although we've seen a lot of progress towards climate goals, decreasing, environmental challenges, integrating sustainable development goals in humanitarian policies, we're quite a long way off from achieving any energy-related goals through policy in the sector or within refugee hosting countries. So I guess this webinar is to help set the scene again, to engage the different experts and practitioners and the humanitarian energy scholars on the call to help fully comprehend actually what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, how we're designing and implementing energy policies within the sector, and how global and national policies can be more inclusive of refugee and displaced populations. So that's the initial welcome blurb, but I'm going to run to the next slide just to share a couple of house rules, then talk about what we're going to do in this session. So Joel, the next slide, please. So just a few of the house rules. Please stay on mute upon entry. We're obviously recording this webinar and hope to use it and disperse it as wide as possible after the webinar. And please just get those questions into the Zoom chat. We're really looking forward to hearing from all of the audience and making this a really engaging session. And I'm just going to do this, but please follow us on the HEED Twitter and tweet anything humanitarian energy today. It's a really interesting week as well, globally in terms of policies and UN assemblies. So let's try and get ourselves heard today. So in terms of the schedule, we're going to have a really nice kind of 15-minute slot where, again, like the other webinars, we're going to have an informal coffee session, meet the panelists in 3 to 4 breakout rooms. And, these are going to be 15 minutes where we're just going to answer some basic questions and get to know each other. And then we're going to have jump into a short introductory talk by Thomas Bachrup from the Global Platform of Action, who are our partners for today, to really help us set the scene in terms of the policy context from that global perspective, and just to talk us through the state of the policy, at the moment. And then basically we're going to jump in and hear from our different panelists, and then we're going to go into discussion. So please put in all those questions into the chat box. And if you have any technical issues as well, we have Emily Haddon and Joel Gibbs on the line just to solve any issues. So if you don't get into a breakout room in the next few minutes, please do let us know. Cool. So Emily, could you drop us all into our breakout rooms, please? I do hope you had an interesting and insightful conversation, an introductory session. As we did, we tried to tackle everything under the sun, including programs level policies, technical and economic policies, humanitarian and development sector policies, and national government policies. So there's obviously so much happening in this sector, and this is why we're going to take it back up a notch and talk about the global level. And this is where our introductory speaker, Thomas Fahrob, from the Global Platform of Action, who is actually the strategic lead of the coordination unit for the GPA, is going to try and give us that kind of set the scene and introductory couple of minutes. And also just to say the GPA is a multi-stakeholder movement that mainstreams sustainable energy solutions across the humanitarian system. Their vision is to provide access to sustainable energy solutions for all displaced people and their hosts by 2030. So yeah, Thomas is working on renewable energy solutions for refugee camps since about 5 years and formerly worked in various positions for the government of Germany. So please, Thomas, take it away, and I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this.
Thanks, Hajar. Great to see so many familiar faces on the screen. I have structured my little introduction into 3 parts. First, I want to try to wake you up with a gloomy picture. Second, I will provide you with some light at the end of the tunnel, maybe, and then some recommendations. So when we look at the policy topic in displacement settings, I think we can distinguish between 3 target groups. We have the humanitarian organizations, we have the host countries, and we have the donor countries / the international community. And I want to give you some examples why I think if we don't change, we will fall short on SDG 7 and we won't reach our target. First, let's start with the humanitarian actors and with the low-hanging fruit. And I want you to take away one number from my little presentation. This is 11,400. 11,400 is the amount of diesel generators that 7 humanitarian organizations are currently using, the largest 7 humanitarian organizations. That does not include NGOs, INGOs, local partners, and all of this. And many other partners are also not included in this number. So the actual number is even higher. But that came out of a recent survey we conducted with these organizations together. And we estimate this leads to an expenditure of more than $100 million per year just for the diesel, and roughly 200,000 tons of CO2, which is something like 70,000 return flights from London to Nairobi. This is the amount of CO2 emitted by these generators. And now guess how many of these agencies have a clear exit strategy? None. And as long as we don't have this, as long as they don't even do this bit of their work, which is easy to control, it will be difficult. Another example is the use of firewood. We recently had a high-level conversation with one of the agencies. I won't mention the name here. And we talked about the use of firewood. And basically, the feedback we got was, yeah, you know, if in an emergency or even in a protected crisis, if we have to cut down trees to provide firewood, then that's it. We cut down trees. If we have to use mud stoves because there are no other available technologies, then we do this. And as long as there is no clear environmental and climate policy in place with these agencies, and as long as we have this sort of cowboy mentality, we are here to protect lives and save lives, then we will fall short on our targets. Now to the second group, host countries. Also here on host countries, we can talk about, for example, these diesel subsidies. They're using precious budgets from their own national budget to subsidize a technology from the last century. And obviously, everybody is afraid of higher energy prices. That's why they're doing it. But as long as this is the case, we won't see changes also in the humanitarian space, for example. But even more important from the country perspective is the refugee policy in general. We can design as many cool and sustainable energy project as we like, as long as the people, the displaced people, have no right to work and cannot earn an income, every project will fail or will fall short. And the third party in this game is the international community and the donor community. And for example, we usually run into open doors when it comes to include any text about energy for the displaced population. For example, in meetings like tomorrow from the high-level dialogue on energy. So there is a general interest and an honest interest, I think, from the international community to include these people into policy papers that are non-committal and that are vague and all of this. But the moment it comes to, yes, let's include the displaced population in a certain country in a future energy program, then it's getting difficult. And it's so unfair from our perspective, just because someone is currently in a displacement settings, he or she cannot be part of such a program. So this is really where we need to change and where we need to also to overcome the silos in the international community. Now to a little bit of more positive news, maybe some examples, because I don't want to share only a gloomy picture here. We see, for example, from UNHCR, they have an energy strategy, they have a climate strategy in place, and it's now going to be implemented step by step. We see a similar process with UNICEF and other organizations. We see a lot of interest, especially from the NGO world. We see the Norwegian Refugee Council, who wants to be climate neutral in 2030. So all these commitments are there. Hopefully, they will be accommodated with accompanied by decent resources for that. Second, on the host countries, we see our prime example, Uganda. They developed an entire energy strategy for the displacement settings, which is now going to be part of the national energy strategy. And in case we have donors on the call here, if you have 250 million left over, that is roughly the amount we need to provide decent clean energy solutions to the displaced population in Uganda. Having said this took more than 2 years and an army of energy experts to develop these plans. And this is the amount of magnitude we're talking about here. And finally, on the donor community / international community, we see, of course, countries like Germany and Norway pushing this topic. We see the EU developing an environmental requirement strategy and policy that will increase also the pressure on the humanitarian partners to go green and to be part of the green shift in general. We also see the World Bank who are now developing inclusive energy programs where they include the displaced populations and discuss with national partners how they can be supported. And my final point, recommendations, and these are not just coming from me. In fact, it's a work done together with Phil Sandwell from Imperial College, which many of you are familiar, I guess, and Eva Mach from IOM. And we recently drafted a policy paper for one of these international fora, and we came up with 4 recommendations. First one is provide evidence what worked, what didn't, through solid research and data. And I mean, that's something you like, I guess, from the academic world. Second, be serious about really overcoming silos. We see in many of these countries, we see similar challenges in the development world, in the peacekeeping world, and in the humanitarian space. And while in the latter, we have very limited expertise, in the development space, there are a number of energy experts running around in these countries, for example. Talk to them. Do develop something together with them, and in order to also provide progress for the displaced population. The third point is, as we already mentioned also in our breakout room, integrate energy and national and international agendas and policies. I just mentioned it is not easy to be very concrete in a certain moment, but it is possible, and it's the only way to reach large scale. And my final point, do focus also on innovative finance solutions that provide the ground for large scale improvements, which also includes the private sector. I'm not saying that the private sector will solve all the issues here, but there certainly is an extremely important part of this endeavor, and without them, we won't be able to achieve it. But I'm sure these wonderful panelists coming up have much more to say, and I'm handing over back to Aja. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, and thanks for setting that scene, which importantly will kind of help us discuss further the next couple of points. So without not wanting to take much more time, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists, and then, as I said, I'll give them 5 minutes each, and then we'll get into the discussion. So our first panelist is Katrina Pielli, who is an energy consultant with 20 years experience engaging at several different levels across the US, Africa, and the Middle East. She's helped shape energy policy, drive national programs, and build partnerships between public and private sector organizations. Currently, she's working to provide expert services to advance energy and climate initiatives, working with governments, philanthropic agencies, humanitarian agencies, and the private sector. She worked on the World Food Programme in developing, or worked with the food programme to develop a training for humanitarian energy practitioners, and drives market-based programs with UNITAR. Previously, Katrina served as a senior project director and energy expert at the US Agency for International Development, where she developed and led multiple programs, one of which was the groundbreaking Smart Communities Coalition, SEC, with MasterCard. She also serves as the director of the Scaling Off-Grid Energy Grand Challenge for the development, and led by Power Africa's Off-Grid Energy Access Program. Yeah, I could go on and speak about Katrina for another 5 minutes, but I do apologize. I'm going to introduce my next speaker, and I'm very excited to hear from each of them after I've introduced all of them. So also our second speaker is Stephen Kichonga, who has also 20 years experience in providing leadership coordination, technical and resource mobilization and partnerships. He's worked in country offices providing policy and programming support in energy, climate change, and the environment. He currently works as a regional energy and environment advisor at the Nature, Climate and Energy team at the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, at their regional hub in Amman in Jordan, where he oversees sustainable energy, climate change, and environment in the context of sustainable development across countries in the Arab region. We have then our very own Dr. Sarah Rosenberg-Janssen, who is a researcher with University of Oxford and the research lead for the GPA. She is also an expert advisor on humanitarian energy with experience leading sustainable energy work with displaced communities in several different contexts, including Rwanda, Kenya, Jordan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burkina Faso. She co-chairs the GPA Research and Evidence Group, which provides actually strategic advice to the UN on inclusive energy programming. And she supports actually academics, young and older academics, I should say, in the space. And she previously worked with the UN Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the University of Oxford, obviously Imperial College, and the Climate Policy Initiative, and the University of Cambridge. And finally, we have Luke Sevieri from Sustainable Energy for All, who is a programs manager at SE4, focusing on the energy access gap in the last mile, in particular for the health sector and the humanitarian sector. He holds a master's in commercial energy from KU Leuven and a master's in development management from the London School of Economics. Prior to this, he worked in several different contexts, including Mozambique, Senegal, Liberia, for international NGOs, social enterprises, such as Save the Children International and the UN Foundation. And yeah, I'm very, very excited to have these four high-level panelists, and hopefully they'll take the discussion to the next level. We have 3 questions we'd like to answer today. How can refugee, host community, energy, or refugee policy become more inclusive of displaced populations? How can we go beyond policy superficiality in the humanitarian sector to enable humanitarian energy access? And finally, how can we make humanitarian energy more inclusive and more radical over the next 10 years? And I'm going to invite Katrina to go first to share her position, and then the rest of the panelists. Please feel free.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. Good morning. So just a quick clarification, even though I do have a number of clients, including World Food Program and Rockefeller and others, these are my own remarks and are not attributable to any of my clients. So really what's exciting to me about this session was the question that Hajar started with, which is what are we doing wrong and how can we fix it when we look ahead in the coming years? How do we really make change and how can policy drive that? And I think for me, there's a number of ways to answer this, and I'm excited to hear from my fellow panelists and also from the participants. You know, I think a few points to kick off with. Often I think we assume that the broader political considerations don't really exist. And what I mean by that is that the national and the government tone and tenor around the refugees and the displaced persons really does have a significant impact on how energy is handled in displacement settings, and particularly the related policies. Thomas mentioned the underpinning need for refugees to have the right to work and to generate income. That really is critical to any of our energy ambitions being able to succeed. So I think we have to consider and truly understand who are the influencers that can help us advocate for the policies, particularly at the national level, that are needed to really help enable the energy solutions that we all have ambitions to implement to succeed. I think for protracted settings, we have to really be serious about stopping energy product giveaways and fully subsidized mini grids. I think we really have to truly look to market-based approaches with smart demand-side subsidies where needed, but really ending the giveaway of these products is so critical when we think about the markets that exist and that, again, we want to foster. I think we honestly have to truly reflect on the humanitarian industry and ask how we can disrupt that. For example, in Kakuma, there's such a strong contingent around the diesel supply chain, often called the diesel mafia. And I recall very distinctly wanting to bring in private sector energy suppliers and was basically told no, that we couldn't do that because that would disrupt the diesel value chain. And I think that type of narrow-minded and unproductive thinking is really what hinders our success. There are ways to actually thread that needle. Meanwhile, the communities are paying high prices for diesel power generation. The pollution is increasing. There are unsustainable and unreliable energy products being offered. And we can bring in the private sector and we can do it in a way that actually is inclusive. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to honestly break down that silo. And then finally, I think we really have to embrace the private sector, not just as CSR funders, but as true partners. There are shrinking humanitarian budgets and we can't overcome the challenges that we face just by public money. We really need to bring in private sector money, innovation, their commitment to actually doing good in the world, and be okay with the fact that yes, they might make a profit, but really this is giving the displaced person's agency and choice and dignity. And I think that we are seeing this more and more, and it's exciting, but we need to do even better, and we need to thread that needle even at a larger scale to truly achieve our goals. So I will stop there and hand it back to Hajar.
Thanks, Katrina. I mean, the perspective you've just brought has, highlighted obviously so many different levels. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephen.
Just to add on what Katrina has mentioned, is to add the fact that national policies are extremely important when it comes to dealing with the energy situation in the humanitarian situation and making sure it is inclusive. The reasons being that the countries are regarded as sovereign states. That means even where the global agreement or global intentions are different, national governments can always change and decide on what to do. And a good example is what Thomas just mentioned about Uganda. It is because of the Uganda government putting policies that are important for energy that has happened. So to me, national policies are extremely important, harnessing the political will of the governments. But we shouldn't forget the global aspects of policies, in the sense that the global policies, the global agreements that we have, that are there, whether they are for climate change or energy or for dealing with planetary crisis, they all influence how the donor resources that finances energy in refugee or humanitarian situations happen. And that also determines how inclusive they will be, because if you take a very simple example like the climate change agreements, the COP, for example, COP26, there'll be ideas on how you can, countries can implement the NDCs, and through that, governments nationally can decide, should we include this in expanding energy to refugee or humanitarians or displaced populations. And these linkages has to be taken into account, because most of the countries that we are talking about, especially in developing countries, the funding comes from other countries, the donor countries. And that is where the elements of inclusivity could come about, because funding for energy in the refugee situation is not done in a vacuum. It's done within a context of national development priorities and policies. I think that the most interesting point about this I want to mention is the linkages to global challenges, both planetary and others. For example, I mentioned the climate change, but currently, when you look at the pandemic and the responses that are being looked at, some of these pandemic responses have elements of energy in them, and the idea of green recovery and other aspects like that could have a big influence on how much resources, financial resources will flow to the energy sector in terms of responding to refugee policy and other considerations. And finally, I just wanted to mention partnerships. Partnerships are a big component of this in the sense that the displaced situations, populations and refugees and everything else requires a lot of partnerships. And I think at the global level, the GPA is playing a big role there. At the local level, there are a lot of partnerships that are happening between development and humanitarian, and also the private sector, including looking at ways how we can de-risk investments and financing through the private sector. Over.
Thanks, Stephen. Really interesting perspective and linkages, actually. I'm really excited to kind of talk some of yours and Katrina's perspective in the panel, but I'm going to hand over to Sarah to give us a quick introductory perspective.
Yeah, sure. And I'll be very quick because I want to leave lots of time to discuss all the interesting things that people have just said. But I guess from my perspective, I really like the title of this webinar on future proofing. And I think we really need to, as well as considering the sort of, local and national policy angles, need to consider this global context, as Katrina said. Most of the world is facing multiple protracted humanitarian crises in the global south, compounded by the climate crisis, compounded by the COVID and Build Back Better initiatives following the pandemic. In all those challenges and in all that complexity, and to be honest, all that noise within the humanitarian system, I think sometimes other parts of the system forget energy access. It is just so important for both quality of life for displaced people. Many people are still living in the dark in quite dangerous, very vulnerable situations. And when we're talking about the renewable and sustainable transitions, I really think we should also be talking about access and the tiers of access and how important the different levels of energy access are for individuals, for families living in refugee and displacement situations. I guess from an academic angle, as the appointed academic on the panel, I really do want to flag this need for data and research. at points in this system, we don't know what we don't know. You know, we can't measure things. We don't have basic evidence and information. And we really need that to underpin progress within the sector and actually be able to measure what is working and what isn't working. And then my last point is really on this importance of strengthening governance, strengthening policies. We talked a little bit in our coffee breakout room about holding institutions, especially humanitarian agencies, to account, and that can be all of our roles, especially as our role as academics who perhaps have a little bit more freedom of speech than some people are already based within organizations. And how can we really hold institutions to account and say, you know, you did promise this in your policy. Have you done it? How have you done it? Please show us the evidence, and then be able to share and explore that evidence as a group. So I'll finish there because I really want to move on to the questions at some point. But thanks, Hajar, that was great.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Data. I keep hearing that, but hopefully we talk about that as well in terms of the panel. So thank you, Luke. A few words from you will be great.
Yeah, thanks. And always difficult to follow these speakers, to follow my colleagues here. So I'll try to say something that the others have not said, but there'll be a little bit of overlap. But let me start with something that's maybe obvious, but something that we often forget. And that's when we talk about humanitarian energy, there are several components to it. And we shouldn't think that when we talk about greening the operations, replacing diesel gensets, that is all of the story. We shouldn't think about if all the refugees, all the displaced households have energy access, that's the end of it. We need both. We need to work on both tiers. And often we work at one at the expense of the other, because they can be approached in very different ways. So it's just, I think it's an important point to make that, like, if we approach it from, like, let's get rid of all the diesel gensets, that in and of itself would not automatically result to improved quality of life or improved services for refugees. We hope it will, we think it can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So that's kind of, it leads us to, you know, bringing myself back to my academic background as well, the political economy of humanitarian energy, which, like, we know this is difficult. We know policy is difficult. Policy is slow. It is very slow. It is very important, but it is very slow. So just to maybe recap some of the points that I think have been made by the previous speakers around how can we prioritize energy in the humanitarian sector? Who has the mandate? And I do not have the answer there. It's clear that when you look at any particular humanitarian setting, you can have, you know, like FAO, WFP, UNHCR, IOM, UNDP, and that's just naming the UN agencies, right? Like many other NGOs, many other civil society organizations, private sector actors, etc., can offer services that are energy dependent, that are energy related. So the question is, how do we coordinate that? How do we make sure that we, you know, that we approach it in a similar way, that we don't duplicate efforts, which, you know, we tend to do quite often. Thomas mentioned energy strategies or climate strategies for all these organizations. How do they align when we overlap them, when we compare them between each other? Are there commonalities? Is there like a common standard across energy access that we all want to go for? Like, when we look at climate, when we look at the diesel genset, carbon neutrality tends to be an easy standard to aim for, a difficult one, but it's an obvious one. In energy access, there's still the debate in terms of how far do we need to go. There's a tiering system. Like, what do we really need to aim for, and who is responsible for which part of that very long and complicated value chain? And of course, when we talk about energy access, sustainability is a very, very critical word, which is overused. You know, like, we use the word sustainability too much, but it is very important. So when we talk about sustainability, I think, like, what's important to keep in mind is think 10 years, think 15 years, right? Like that just keep that in mind, and try to square that with a humanitarian response, which, like, in the DNA of many of these humanitarian agencies is short-termism, it's urgency, it's speed, it needs to be resolved today. So how do we resolve that? Again, maybe I'm asking more questions than providing answers, but hey, you know, like, we're going into the Q&A. So I think it's just very important to keep that in mind. Second point I do want to make is nationally, like, looking at this from a national perspective. Again, political economy, policies, yes, very important. Uganda's brought up over and over again. Uganda is a little bit of an outlier, and I hope that we, like, as a sector, can use what is happening in Uganda to show, to almost use it a bit as a template to show like what can happen if you pursue certain policies over others. If you go down the inclusivity road, if you look at minimum quality standards and you really try to do it well, what can happen? What is the value that you get when you invest in energy, when you invest in refugees and in displaced households? Because we don't really have that example either. And the spectrum between like, which kind of policies governments can take or can lean on is quite wide. And I do want to like, play a little bit devil's advocate here as well. Try to put yourself in the shoes of, you know, like a mayor or somebody who works at the district level or a minister. When you look at a refugee camp, you look at displaced households in a country like Kenya, Uganda, which are like half, less than half, just over half electrified themselves, right? You look at the host communities, most of them live in very similar settings, very similar environments than the refugee camp a few kilometers down the road. So how do you justify increased investment in energy access for refugees, for refugee camps, if you risk, for example, keeping the host communities, kind of keeping them back or keeping them as is? So like it's very important to position as an and story. Make sure that you work together with host communities. Make sure that you look at the refugee setting as part of a much larger context and not as a silo. I think like breaking those silos is a very important point. Maybe I'll leave it at that. No, the last point I do want to make is people. It comes down to people. We talk about policies, it always comes down to people. You need excellent people. You need the energy officer at UNHCR. You need the analysts at the Rural Electrification Agency. You need all these people to really care about the topic as well and to really drive this agenda, because policies are only as strong as the people that implement them and that follow them or that want to pursue them. So yeah, it starts with all of us here as well, right? I give a strong group of people here, but clearly the group needs to get much larger. Hajar, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Luke. I think you took on quite a lot there in terms of, you know, political economies and policies in specific countries. But what I want to draw back to is host level, national level policies and how they can become inclusive. And I think it was Stephen who touched on this. But I want to ask, how do we make humanitarian energy more politically and economically feasible for these national governments? And I know that you have some really interesting examples in addition to Uganda. And so I'd love to hear from you on that, actually.
Sorry, is this a question to me?
It was to Stephen, but
to Stephen, good.
Feel free.
Stephen, take this one, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think to make it politically feasible is to make sure that it is part of the larger, as other speakers have said, the larger national development priorities. And then we in this region where I am, we have very good examples of that in Jordan and Lebanon, where because of the Syrian crisis, they developed the Lebanon response plan and the Jordan response plan, which were to deal with the extra burden that was that came about because of the refugee crisis. And that didn't just look at energy, it looked at all the various services, from education to health to energy to all sorts of things, to water, to waste management. And because of that, it becomes part of the political will, I mean, the trajectory that the government want to go. And the governments have used that as a way of raising resources from outside to include them in their own national development plans, you know, supporting host communities and also the refugees. So that's one way of doing it, to make sure it is in the political will. The second one is for countries who don't have that kind of thing, is to mainstream it within the recovery and stabilization programs. This one has happened in, for example, countries like Iraq, where, for example, the funding facility for stabilization for Iraq, which is $1 billion US sort of fad since 2015 is part of the government priorities, which is implemented by various governments, various stakeholders, including private sector, NGOs, and the others. So that's the second way of doing this. I'll leave it there. I'm sure my colleagues or panelists can add more. Over.
Thanks, Stephen. Luke, could you further elaborate on that question as well? And how do you make it more politically and economically feasible for these national governments? And perhaps you could give us the kind of the global view, the top level view.
Is it?
I think it's a tricky one, right? Because I think there are many areas that need to move kind of in the same direction. I think Sarah's point on data, like what works, what doesn't work. We need to first also understand how big the gap is, both globally, but also nationally. What is the actual gap? What is the energy gap? What are the energy needs? What are, therefore, also the most appropriate energy solutions? Because without knowing that, it's very hard to really capture how we can best approach it. Like which delivery models, which approaches can we deploy to reach the most long-term sustainable outcome? Money talks, right? Money is still extremely important in this space. So if this becomes a priority at some point, if, for example, like, say the World Bank comes into a particular country and says, we want universal energy access, and like that means universal, that means like national, every single person. I mean, there's going to be much less pushback compared to if you say we have enough funds to electrify 20% of your people. You know, like this is like looking at it from an inclusivity point, but with a clear target of being everyone, which includes everyone. I think that could kind of change the narrative a bit, but we know that it's very difficult because the problem is large. We're talking about globally, we're talking about 700+ million people that do not have access to electricity. We're talking 2.6 billion who do not have access to clean cooking fuels or technologies. And that number, we shouldn't look at that from a stationary perspective. You know, population growth is a real thing. As we electrify more and more people, there will also be more and more that that group, it kind of changes. And the same goes for for refugees and displaced households. It's a little bit of a moving target. Like sometimes people leave, they go back, then camps grow, they shrink, etc. It is hard to achieve. So again, not really offering that many solutions there, Hajar. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's why we're here to have the discussion and make sure that we're asking these questions over and over again until we actually get the right answers. But that's really interesting. I think I'm going to move on to the kind of the second big question, where how do we go beyond this policy superficiality within the humanitarian sector? And I know I've been told off for saying this several times, but I think what do we actually need to do? Because we've heard a lot about who actually is leading this, that money talks, that donor country development plans and national level plans are really important to this discussion. What can we do within this humanitarian sector? So Sarah, I'm going to throw that one on to you if you don't mind helping answer that, and then hopefully Katrina, it'd be great to hear from you as well. So how can we go beyond the business as usual methods of working?
I mean, what a massive, difficult question. I mean, there's so many things that, right? I mean, we talked about data, we talked about holding agencies accountable. I think from my perspective, increasingly, I see the need to be more progressive in these spaces and to raise our voices up, to include displaced people in the panels, in the discussions, like in the room, to hear from them, because it can get a little bit abstract. You can, you hear the big agencies saying things like, oh, tier 1 is fine, tier 2 is fine for electricity access. The realities of that are that that's a couple of light bulbs and maybe a phone charge every so often. Could you live with that type? Could any of us live with that type of electricity access? No, we couldn't do this call with that level of electricity access. And so I think making it very concrete and bringing it back to the technologies, bringing it back to the appliances. This is what my phone needs, this is what my computer needs, this is what my Wi-Fi needs. And on the cooking side as well, I'm just a bit more of an electricity nerd at the moment. And so I think in terms of how we go beyond that policy superficiality, that link of bringing it back to technologies, bringing it back to people's day-to-day realities. I can't remember what famous author said this, but somebody once said that facts don't change anything, but stories do. And so telling people stories, bringing it back to their realities and saying, you know, this wouldn't be acceptable for a UNHCR staff member in terms of energy access. It wouldn't be acceptable for me for a level of energy access. So why is it acceptable for, you know, your average Ugandan or your average refugee living in Uganda, or any of, you know, the displaced communities? And so I think having those concrete examples and weaving them into policies might help things become a little bit more progressive. In terms of the more concrete elements of measuring policy and holding organizations to accountability, that's where I come back to the data point, which is that at the moment, you know, in most countries in the world, in the global south, we don't know how many people in that country have energy access and what type of energy access. The World Bank does some estimations, but it really is estimations. And then within that context, we also don't know how many refugees have access and what type of access they have. And so if we don't even have the most basic data on what people have right now and what they might need, then how can we really talk about solutions and, you know, changing policies and having more progressive policies? So we do need that core data, you know, alongside everything else in terms of concrete solutions. But yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. But there's a lot of things we could do. In fact, we have to do everything, right? Maybe that's my answer. What do we need to do? Everything.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I was actually going to lead on and say what policies do we actually need to have, but I think I'm just going to leave it there and hear from Katrina, because we need to start trying to focus a little bit more for our audience. So yeah, Katrina, what do you think we need to be doing in terms of policy? Is there a specific type of policy that we need to design, or are there models that we need to use and that need to start, we need to put into action, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what my colleagues have said. You know, I think that there is such a space that brings together advocacy across organizational types, because government and, you know, kind of national, but also international government donors really react to what they're hearing from others. And so if you can bring in, as Luke said, money talks, the private sector, you can bring in the donors, and you can actually make a compelling case jointly for why policy changes make sense for the government, for their economy, and also then how it can bring in new funding. That will always be a compelling situation. And then you combine that with the stories like Sarah is saying, and you've really got the beginnings of a recipe that can lead to change. I think trying to do it piecemeal and on your own, you know, one organization or one entity by yourself will generally not be the best solution, in my opinion. I think looking for those unlikely coalition partners is really going to be important. I think the other point, I put it in the chat, but, you know, Luke had mentioned it originally, you can drive a lot of change through these large envelopes of funding. I know we keep talking about Uganda, it's a bit of a broken record on all these calls, but the large World Bank Energy Access Program, EASP, I think is a really exciting development, because it actually is bringing in an entire component on refugee, an entire component on development, and an entire component on grid. And you're actually bringing all of that together in one massive program that's leading towards a holistic approach. And I think that's just the beginning of what could be done through the likes of World Bank, other IFIs, donor agencies like MCC from the US, that requires these policy triggers to then unlock the funding. That is risky, of course, because then you're imposing policy changes on the national government. So ideally, these are policy changes that the national government also agrees with and finds helpful, going back to the conversation in my breakout group. I'll stop there. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Katrina. And I think this leads to the whole next 10 years. How can we be more radical? I feel as though we're already having a lot of radical conversations here, because we're talking about actually who's governing and, you know, what matters, and you know, what changes we need to make to funding systems and national government changes and triggers. And I want to hear from Stephen, and where do we see this going in the next 10 years? Because we can sit around talking about policy for, you know, for the next year, but if we don't have a way of implementing these policies and making these changes, or triggering this change through perhaps governance or changes in the humanitarian system itself, And I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very tough question, but I'll try to answer it from my point of view. I think the first thing to do is to, for example, acknowledge the fact that the countries that are holding refugees or dealing with humanitarian situations are very different. You know, we have, in some cases, high-income countries, low-income countries. In others, we have countries in crisis themselves. So it's a basket of different sort of things. And if we really need to be radical into this, is looking at each sort of category of these countries, and first of all address the missing elements. For example, in some countries it will be missing institutions, others it will be missing infrastructure, others it is to do with capacities of different ways. So in that cases, once we are able to delineate these countries into different categories, we can be able then to say, possibly in this country, what we need to do is improve the institutional capacity for doing certain things. In another one, it might be, let's revitalize the infrastructure that has been destroyed, whether it's through an earthquake or a crisis, humanitarian crisis or civil conflicts. So we need to start from there. And then the next thing that I see need to be done is, de-risking, financing for de-risking. What do I mean by that is that in many cases we have policy de-risking where you want to invite the private sector to encourage the private sector to invest and finance different programs in those countries. But before the private sector comes in, we need also to finance the de-risking process itself. Here, what we mean is that process of facilitating the private sector to access finance to invest in renewable energy in those particular countries that they feel they cannot go because of the perceived risks. So we need those type of radical things to be done, not just financial de-risking aspects, but financing for de-risking to happen. So if you look at it, we need to have, because we know that the money that is coming from the public sector is just enough to do a certain thing, but majority of the money is in the private sector. Therefore, if we really need to be radical, we need to make sure that the private sector participates in this field of humanitarian and refugee situation, because right now it's dominated by the public sector. And for me, to do that, we need policy de-risking activities. We also need financial de-risking activities, but we also need the third part, which I'm calling putting in place a financing mechanism to finance the de-risking itself. So these are just a few ideas that I thought about, which can be radical in the sense that most of these have not been tested in many countries. For example, where a private sector wants to invest in a refugee situation, you need a guarantee mechanism from either a country or an insurance company, both private or public, to be able to do that just in case something happens to their investments. Over.
Thanks, Stephen. There's so much there for us to think about, and definitely radical systems, especially when it comes to, funding systems and de-risking financial systems for programming to happen and for private sector engagement. I think that leads to, but who is going to govern this, and do we need to radically change things in terms of the humanitarian system, or do we need to create this new parallel system of governance, for example, in order for us to devise policies, in order for us to ensure energy access for displaced populations at that national and local level? I don't know, I want to ask Sarah this question, but I don't think I know the answer to this. But I'd love to hear from Luke or Sarah or Katrina on this. Will we need to have governance that's potentially institutional, regional, or is it just going to be every country for itself kind of thing who has to do this? That is another huge question, I realize, but I'm open for an answer from anyone.
I throw that one at Luke. I'm not going to answer that question.
I was trying to be silent for a while to hope that somebody else would step up. Let me divert just a second and pick up on what Stephen said around de-risking. I'd add like having the right incentives as well. I think those are mechanisms. They're critical to make any radical change. We need risk takers as well. So again, it kind of brings us back to that point of people or organizations. We do need organizations who will be willing to absorb a large share of the long-term risk, because otherwise this is not going to happen automatically. We talk a lot about the private sector, we talk about market mechanisms, but market mechanisms will work when the risk is appropriately divided, and when organizations feel, okay, this is worth it, this is something that I feel we can get out of most of the time. So that I think is quite critical. In terms of a parallel system to develop governance policy, I would argue no. I think we have enough cooks in the kitchen already. We don't need another kitchen. I think it's more about leadership, right? It's about, I brought this up before, is who has the mandate, and this is the problem that we face, not just in humanitarian energy. It's about anything in energy, right? Energy, it's so cross-cutting. Everyone feels like they have a role to play. There's not one agency that has this as their core mandate that every organization can look up to and say, okay, you're in the lead. Depending on the subsector, be it like humanitarian energy for water, humanitarian energy for health, for education, for productive use, whatever. There are other agencies that can be in the lead. Depending on geographies, it could be more on, this is more migration, this is more refugees. Again, so IOM versus UNHCR. So those things, like it is going to be quite country specific or context specific, but because of that, I do think there's an important role for that global, like that global target setting, ambition raising coordination mechanism to really, and I know this is, maybe this is appropriate given that it's UNGA, we have the high level dialogue tomorrow. That's really, that is the value of that. And in and of itself, let's argue that it has no value. But if there's enough organizations that follow up on it, that really say, okay, if this is the core target globally, let's see how that, right, like how that translates down to a country context or to a district context. But yeah, ultimately, I think it comes down to who is willing to take the risk, who is willing to step up, and this is going to always be a difficult issue, because we're kind of like all the same, we're all equals here in the sense like nobody's willing or able. I think nobody's really able to take that lead and to be the leader. And so like we are we're setting out the course, we're setting out the path, and everyone else can kind of follow in our wake.
And I just wanted to just, oh, sorry, no, you go, Katrina, I've spoken more than enough.
No, I'll be quick. Please don't create a parallel structure. I think what we've heard, a common theme, is breaking down the silos, and creating new structures is just going against that. So I would just really urge and plead, let's see how we can actually work together and not try to create something separate. And then the idea of the de-risking and the financing, 100%, but you need policies to provide the certainty for the investors to actually come in. Without that, you'll see what we've seen with the mini grid sector for forever, is that there's no certainty, so the investors say it's too risky and they won't come in. So the idea of the financing is so intrinsically linked to having clear rules of the road. You can't really have the financing without the policy. Over to you, Sarah.
I guess I just wanted to build on those points, and also just to challenge them a little bit, because I completely agree we don't need a parallel system, but what I do think is that we really need to challenge the current system. And I guess when Luke was talking about remits and that no one organization has the sort of global remit to lead this space, I mean, that's really why we sort of created the GPA to bring all those organizations and all those remits together. I don't want to speak for Thomas, who's still on the call, but this is very much something that the GPA is doing. It's like pushing forward that envelope, is providing the learning, providing the technical work, providing this like standard setting to bring all of those groups together and say, how can we be more progressive, and how can we become more radical? I guess I'd just like to, you know, make another point about inclusivity. There is the great slogan of the Global Refugee-Led Network, which is nothing about us without us. And I feel that we could take that lesson for our own sector as well, including refugees and displaced people directly in these types of conversations and directly in the planning work and the global policy making work, as well as, of course, in the national local work. And that active planning and that active mode of inclusion really needs to start happening from now on. And I think as soon as we do that, we will see that the move towards renewables, the move towards things being truly sustainable, having these long 10-year plans, that will start to flow a little bit more easily, because we won't be having these conversations about, is that really needed? When it's obvious that that is really needed, both for climate reasons and for access reasons. And then one of the other points that I'd just like to make in terms of how we can become more radical, one thing I'd love to see in all our sort of target setting and in all our quantification of this space is to stop talking about tier 1 and tier 2. I mean, it's such a tiny amount. It's always seen as a little stepping stone, both for cooking and for electricity. But, you know, for example, the UNHCR strategy says that they aim to provide 200 watt hours per day per family for electricity access. It's just a couple of light bulbs really, and that even that seems like a massive stretch that won't be possible for all refugee communities in the next 10 years. But when we take a step back and we think about how much electricity that really is, it's absolutely nothing. The modern energy minimum work of the Energy for Growth group really says that we should be aiming for more like 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, which is quite radical. You know, it's several orders of magnitude more. And so how can we embed those types of quantification, those types of discussions into these policy discussions and the standard setting that is going to be happening going forward? So just wanted to make that point about quantification and about really understanding the physical needs as well behind this system. But yeah, thanks. And I agree with so many of the points that Katrina and Luke and Stephen made as well. I'm cautious of the time. We might want to take some other questions as well. Thanks.
Yeah, nicely put, definitely, Sarah, and bringing us to the end of that part of the discussion. And I just wanted to open it up to anybody who wants to ask a question from the audience. Hopefully we haven't confused you too much. Hopefully you'll go home and write a book about this, or think, you know, on multiple levels, on that national government level, within the humanitarian sector, and finally, in terms of what the future of humanitarian energy system governance looks like. So, anybody have any questions? I think we've scared off our participants somehow. Yeah, so perhaps just to have a couple of concluding remarks, if anybody wants to, you know, mention one last takeaway. Oh, Ella, please feel free to put your question in the, or speak up.
Okay. Yeah, if I may, some practical approach. I was many years ago. I was when I was a child. My father made very simply a wheel, and I see that behind the catering is the very nice stream. And he put the wheel on the stream and then connected to the small ball, and we have a light. And it was my first experience of how to make energy when I was a child. And the second thing, when I was a child, I went many years for scouts camps, and believe me or not, we had no one energy supply, nothing. We managed the whole 100 children camp without any energy supply. Of course, we had wood because it was in the mountains. My point is, because the time is coming, very difficult time, everything will be about adaptation, adaptation, and adaptation. I think we have to look what the place offer, what we can do in this place, in this situation in the country. And then when we've got a very clear point, very clear imagination, what we would like to need, what we would like to do, then after we can ask about some money from governments or from the companies. But first, we have to think about how to adapt. And I think the many energy should be put to make some agency to help people adapt in the place when they are. And from other side, there should be agencies who can offer the help, but only when we've got the clear vision what we really need, because maybe we'll need only the will, and we've got a stream, we will have an energy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ella. I think that really kind of feeds into the data and needs of the different populations, and potentially translating that back into, you know, the policy level. So we've talked about a huge number of things today. We talked about the national level inclusivity, and what we saw was there are some really interesting and important progress in this area, such as the Uganda policies, the Jordan response plan, and the Lebanese response plan. So we know that on the national level, this is actually happening. It just, you know, takes a little bit more, perhaps, donor funding and different stakeholders to be involved in that process. We talked about the superficiality of policymaking within the humanitarian sector. I'm not entirely sure we actually answered that question, but what we did talk about was going beyond the business as usual methods of working, collecting the data that's needed, and finding decision-making tools that were appropriate to the specific context as well. And I'm sorry, I'm really glossing over a lot of the discussion there. But then the third thing is we talked about where do we see this sector and humanitarian energy in the next 10 years, and how can we be radical about this? And we talked about de-risking, public and private confidence, I guess, and financial systems in order to include and ensure this humanitarian energy. I'm going to call it a transition for these populations. We also talked about knowing what is missing within this discussion and what gaps are missing in terms of from the institutional perspective, from the infrastructure perspective, and from the capacity perspective within humanitarian agencies and within these new agencies working in this field. I think, Luke, as well, you talked about target setting and ambition raising and goals around this. And I think that's another level that globally we can attach our vision to this and perhaps filter it down to these national and local levels. So I think that really brings us to the end of our session, and I genuinely want to say thank you to everybody who's been a part of this three, you know, really interesting and important webinars. And hopefully we've started the discussion again, and hopefully we can make sure that we continue this discussion through HEED and other formats. So thank you so much to the audience for joining our 3 webinars on co-creation, innovation, and of course this one on policy, looking at humanitarian energy from theory all the way to practice. Hopefully we haven't confused you too much in terms of the policy side of things, but obviously it's a huge topic and it's something that we need a lot more research and data. I don't think my entire 4 years on the PhD, I still know what the end point was there, but I know we have started, and I think that's the main thing. I wanted to really thank the speakers who have, some of them have really gotten up at 5 a.m. all across the world and have really kind of brought such a massive an important and insightful perspective to this discussion today. And I really do want to thank obviously all our partners, GIZ, VBOX, and the GPA for helping us and for being our partner and having these initial discussions with us. And I really want to really thank our marketing and admin team here at HEED. and at Coventry University, who were the superstars behind all of this work. And obviously wanted to thank my own colleagues, Emily Haddon, Joel Gibbs, Alison, and Professor Elena Goria, who has actually given us the opportunity to have these webinars, and of course Ben Robinson, who was my comrade on this series as well. So thanks so much to everybody for joining, and thank you so much for participating, and I wish you a wonderful rest of day. Thank you.